Afternoon. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Laura Polverari. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Padova in Italy, and I will be moderating, and it is my great pleasure to moderate this final panel, this final plenary of this amazing conference. So this is the last plenary, and we will talk about the future of cohesion policy and the research challenges and the research that needs to be done to improve the policy for the future. For the period after 2027. So we have an outstanding group of speakers, so I don't want to take too much time in introducing them, but I need to introduce them. So first to go will be Mr. Marc Lemaitre, who is Director General for Regional and Urban Policy in the European Commission, of course, and is not only the Director General of DG Regio, but also someone who has worked for many, many years on EU cohesion policy, as he was also head of the private office of Regional Policy Commissioner Danuta Hübner first, and then also her successor, Paweł Samecki. So we have a real expert here. The second speaker is also a real expert, and is Andriana Sukova, who is a Deputy Director General in the other DG, in the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. And again, she's in charge of funds, fair transition and analysis, and has also been involved actively in the European Social Fund for many years, and she was Director in DG Employment since 2010. Our third speaker, I don't think I need to introduce him to you because he was a speaker in previous sessions and he's our host here as well. But for those of us who follow the conference remotely on YouTube, I'll introduce him, and it's Šime Erlić. And I really think I pronounced it well. And basically, Šime is the State Secretary in the Ministry of Regional Development and EU funds here in Zagreb, and is in charge of strategic planning and the coordination of EU funds and European territorial cooperation, so quite a broad remit. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Andrés Rodríguez Pose, who, again, I think everyone knows who I'm talking about, but for the sake of being inclusive and introducing everyone, Andrés is Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics, as you know, and is a part-time Professor of Innovation at the University of Stavanger as well in Norway. Is a regular advisor to many international organizations, of course the European Commission, but also the World Bank and numerous UN agencies, and is a very prolific and especially impactful author. His work, I was just checking on Google Scholar, has been cited in other publications about 35,000 times, and he has an H-index. For those of us who work in academia, they know what I mean by H-index of 93, which is massive in the social sciences. So without further ado, I'll let the first speaker take the floor. So Marc, please, if you would like to go and talk. Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Laura, thank you very much for your introductory words. Let me start first by thanking wholeheartedly, through the State Secretary here present, the Croatian government, and in particular the Ministry for Regional Development and EU funds, for having together with the Regional Studies Association, ganged up with us from the European Commission for a third edition of this cohesion policy conference, which I'm sure was long awaited by many people, as in fact, including by me, as in fact the last one took place before I took office in DG Regio. So it's the first time I have the opportunity to participate in one such conference, and I want to thank you very much for that. Certainly, we had to wait, but the moment is a very propitious one. We are 2.5 years away, which is nothing, of having, as Commission, to put on the table new proposals for the main budgetary instruments which the EU would have from 2028 onwards. And in those 2.5 years, no doubt there will be a lot of questions put regarding cohesion policy, and perhaps also existential questions might be put on that. And this is why I believe it is high time, and I'm sure you heard Commissioner Ferreira in setting out how we intend to launch the reflections on the future of cohesion policy, notably through the setting up of an expert group as soon as the beginning of next year. But there will be a hunger on our side for much more input from definitely the academic world, which is well represented here, but also from all the people who make cohesion policy day to day. And here I'm particularly pleased about the title which was chosen, which, as so many things, escaped my attention, so I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I was very happy to learn that the title was about how can cohesion policy rise to the new territorial challenges. And I honestly think that this should be and remain an absolutely central question for reflections on the future, including, let's hope, reflections on the shape of the future EU budget. And in fact, I would like to suggest to you, and it's very personal. I've been in my position for 6 years now. I have had the chance to participate from the start in the reflections on the future back then, which then ended up into a framework for 2021 to 2027 with, I would say, all its breakthroughs, but perhaps also still all its weaknesses and shortcomings. And I have also had the chance, and I hadn't had it before, to see what member states make of the framework, how they translate the framework into programs, and how we negotiate with them on that. And this led me indeed to identifying 3 topics which I, for one, and I say it again very personally, I, for one, think require quite a bit of attention. And the first one is linked to this overall title of this 2-day conference. I would say it in this way. Should we reinforce the territorial dimension of cohesion policy for the future? I think we have ample evidence that convergence will not happen spontaneously, and that there are a lot of forces which demonstrate day by day that they push against convergence. And you have, over the past 2 days, discussed a lot some of these forces. We have a phenomenon which is very present in Europe now, and which is also very present on the other side of the Atlantic, or on the other side, thinking of the EU, of the Channel, which is that we have territories clearly stuck in a downward spiral, relative or even absolute, and this over decades. If we look at ourselves in the mirror, have we made a difference in these areas as cohesion policy? There's little evidence to show that. So we clearly need to redouble our search for solutions for such territories. Then we have, and we will very, very soon put out a paper, I think, depicting the landscape, issues of demography. And we will be looking in particular at areas where there is a particularly strong dynamic towards shrinking working age population, and you have such areas in Europe. Secondly, areas where the improvement in terms of tertiary education is very weak as compared to the general European dynamics. And thirdly, areas where you see a net out migration of younger people. All these factors clearly cannot be very good for the intrinsic dynamism of different territories, and we will be seeing and mapping which territories possibly accumulate these different phenomena. And this, again, is something which we should think about when reflecting on how cohesion policy should address territorial weaknesses in the future. I could also mention rural areas, and I could also mention areas which will be particularly affected by the green transition, but here at least we have already started a more territorial reflection. And I think honestly that the approach of the Just Transition Fund is definitely one which should be a source of potential inspiration for different territorial challenges which we might have, which we will have undoubtedly in the future. And what are, it seems to me, again, benefiting from having now negotiated Just Transition Fund programming and having seen the difficulties to really go through the motions with member states, I think that we have really a basis on which to, a solid basis on which to reflect upon more generally. I think the first specificity of the Just Transition Fund is that upfront we define territories in a detailed way. And we say to member states, and of course, the final coverage of the territories is not exactly what the Commission suggests, but it's very, very close to that in the end. This is the result on the Just Transition Fund. And we tell member states, you need to focus on these territories and you need to think. You need to look, what are the weaknesses really of these territories? What are, in that Just Transition Fund context, what are the transition steps which you will be going through? And what are the consequences, economic, social, and so on? And what are you going to do about it in order to counter this overall? A second element, which I think is absolutely fundamental here in the JTF context, and which is not a walk in the park and not obvious, not easy, because these territories also do not correspond to administrative structures necessarily. So that's a difficulty you have to overcome. So the second essential element is that you have to have a participatory approach, which very often is proclaimed, yes, cohesion policy has a participative approach, but in reality, it can take very different shapes and forms, and also very hollow forms. So I think here under the JTF, because it was a precondition, it happened better than for cohesion policy programs at large. And I think that having all these compulsory steps to look at the problem, to agree basically on what the problem is, to look at the impact of that transition and to look at what you want to do about it, and to agree on all that, produces a much more convincing intervention logic, and one also where the territory is absolutely clear. And I think that we need to look exactly in that direction for many of those forces which we all talk about and recognize, which go against convergence, cohesion. to possibly do a better job in the future at that. My second theme would be one which cohesion policy has also been always a bit torn about or reluctant about, uneasy about, the question of reforms. Policymakers don't like strings to be attached to money. And that's why we always hear, member states know best, give us freedom, we know how to spend the money, and so on and so forth. Well, I think if we are honest again and looking at those challenges ahead, money is not all the answer. And even money, programmed in that very territorial way and comprehensive way and so on, even there, I think we are still missing, potentially, an element of the comprehensive policy reply. We know, I just refer to the 8th cohesion report, sorry for that moment of advertisement for our colleagues' work. We know that there are certain elements which require in certain regions clearly structural improvement, and structural improvement which will not come through spending. It can be about the quality of public administration. And here, let us again be frank. If anything, we have gone backwards. In 1420, we had a thematic objective which was a bit about that. And in fact, it was under the steer of Andriana and DG Employment. For 2021-2027, we have nothing on that. Nothing. We have, for some financing not linked to costs to support administration. But again, this is about spending. This is not about reform of public administration, which would really be more profound. We have issues of quality of education and of training. Again, money is not everything in those areas. We might have, this is one thing which is being put forward, and this is the elephant in the room, right? The Recovery and Resilience Fund. Under the Recovery and Resilience Fund, we have one shining example, as it's always promoted. In Spain, a labor market reform was done as a commitment under the RRF. Well, who would say that where there are issues with the functioning of the labor market, a labor market reform might not be relevant, in fact, in the context of furthering cohesion? So why would we want to necessarily stay away from such issues as the need for a labor market reform? We have very often ineffective, or sometimes even inexistent, innovation ecosystems at regional level. And there again, money is not everything. You need sometimes to change structures, incentive structures, and so on and so forth. So here I would plead on this second theme to have an honest discussion about reforms in the context of cohesion policy and how to potentially embrace a certain reform agenda as a quid pro quo for an investment budget which will be made available through cohesion policy. And I hope we will not stop at the objection, but the money is spent at regional level and the reform is at national level and all this. I mean, again, let's be honest with ourselves. There are certainly, in terms of volume of money, more higher amounts which are programmed through national programs than through regional programs, to start with, under cohesion policy. So this is a fallacious argument. So let's really look honestly at that question of reforms to further, ultimately, cohesion and how we could possibly foresee such a quid pro quo mechanism in cohesion policy. And then thirdly, this is related to our collective experience of the recent past. We are going through crisis times, repeated crisis times. No one wants that, but they befell us, these crises, and certainly we cannot be sure that we will, over the coming decade or so, venture back into calmer waters. And so we do need to think up front how we could have at our disposal something which would be available if a crisis hits, which also strikes, in fact, at the foundations of cohesion. And arguably, the pandemic was such a crisis which shook the cohesion dynamics, the convergence dynamics, and the present energy and broader supply-side crisis is another one which has potential strong asymmetric effects which would go counter to cohesion. And so I think it is also indeed worth reflecting on whether we shouldn't anticipate on such potential developments and foresee potentially some margins for reaction rather than going for what we did lately, shifting away from our long-term direction of travel and undermining, therefore, the structural impact of the policy in order to extinguish some immediate fires. We have done it through the flexibilities we have offered. I would say that overall I was relieved that this only diverted, in inverted commas, 23 billion out of 350 overall. So it didn't totally undermine the long term, but these 23 billion were very much concentrated in what was initially planned for innovation and, in fact, renewables, energy efficiency, and so on. So it's not neutral. When it comes to the additional flexibilities which might be endorsed by the co-legislators related now to the energy crisis, there we might have another up to 10% of cohesion policy allocations going clearly into short-term firefighting and ultimately into the sand, because this type of expenditure will not have structural effects. So one lesson we might want to draw is to anticipate on that and protect the structural part of the policy so that it is not undermined through unexpected developments. I was a bit long. Thank you very much, but I hope that these themes indeed will also resonate with your thinking, and that over the coming 2 years we might see some interesting reflections and insights from your side. And I think it's both true for the academic side and for the practitioner side. These are concrete things, but which, to me, are very much part of the intellectual tug-of-war which we have ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for reminding us that cohesion policy must have a strong territorial dimension, and we really need to think carefully about how we frame it for the future as well. Reminding us as well that money is not everything, and that reforms are important, and that cohesion policy cannot be left out of the reforms that are essential for its success, and that these reforms cannot just be delegated to the next generation UN, RRF, and national recovery and resilience plans. And of course, the issue of crisis, so the need for flexibility, but a flexibility to tackle future crises that cannot harm the long-term perspective of cohesion policy, and this is also quite essential. And yes, so thank you very much. We will not have questions now because we don't have much time, so we will have the various interventions first, and then we have a Q&A at the end. And of course, people following from home can also intervene because we will see their questions and I will relay them to the speakers. Thank you very much. Adriana, up to you then.
So, good afternoon, everyone. And first, joining Mark in thanking the organizers and everyone who put a lot of efforts to have this huge event yesterday and today. I was really impressed. But what is more important for me is my takeaway of very informative, enriching, and inspiring discussions, and also a lot of analysis, results of research that have been shared with us. I couldn't join all the workshops, of course, but I believe that those that I couldn't join were equally interesting and inspiring like the rest. I think it's, as Mark announced, some 2 years ahead of us when we have to identify, to develop, and propose the future of the cohesion policy post-27, and all ideas, all results, all arguments and justifications will be most welcome from any of the research and practitioners' family. We say that this event was delayed by 2 years, but in fact it happens to be positive because we now have a lot of lessons from a difficult time in the last 2 years, and the difficulties continue, they're not over yet, but it shows that we have to protect cohesion policy as the long-term investment instrument, helping structural challenge, supporting structural reforms, and ensuring long-term sustainable growth in Europe and the regions of Europe. I think that we have a lot of complementarity, and the Recovery and Resilience Facility was strongly referred to as one of the major instruments which really pushed member states for reforms which have been long awaited, which have been long requested, but always some excuses were found. Now with the big amounts of money, these reforms happened. So that's the positive side of RRF. We'll see about the investment side of RRF in the next few years. But I also want to underline that cohesion policy is an example of solidarity. And this word was mentioned yesterday. I heard it as well, because we have a lot of common goals, and we should have the common and joint instruments to address and support achieving these common goals. And since I'm coming from DG Employment, and tomorrow we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is in fact the framework for the investments under the European Social Fund Plus, I will briefly refer to some of the key priorities of the European Pillar of Social Rights, just to make sure that people are also hearing about it. And then, of course, I'll speak about skills. That's clear. So the European Pillar of Social Rights, as I said, was proclaimed exactly 5 years ago. And to celebrate this this afternoon and tomorrow, we have in Brussels a big employment and social rights forum, where we are going to take stock of how the 20 rights and principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights have been taken up, both at EU level and at national level. And these rights and principles are focused or grouped in 3 priority areas. The first one is providing equal opportunities and access to the labor market for all. The second one is providing fair working conditions, safe and protective for all. And the third one is social protection and inclusion for the European citizens. I can tell you that we are regularly taking stock of how much legislative policy proposals we have adopted in the Commission, and so far in these 5 years, there are 130 initiatives which are linked to the implementation of the Pillar of Social Rights at EU level, but there are also a lot of these policy initiatives have to be translated and transposed in national legislations. I can mention the recent ones, a number of recommendations. We have the Child Guarantee recommendation, where member states are preparing action plans. They have national child guarantee coordinators to ensure that children from vulnerable backgrounds have equal access to all the services they need, and that we are doing everything possible for these children to have an equal start like the rest of the children. And it's kind of frustrating that in Europe, the richest part of the world, we have still 23 million children at risk of poverty and social exclusion. So in the European Social Fund Plus, we have even a thematic concentration requirement for countries where the percentage of children at risk of poverty and social exclusion is above the EU average. They have to allocate at least 5% of their national ESF Plus budget towards supporting children. And I can tell you that the figure in the programs that we have received and examined so far reaches, the calculation was about 3.5 billion. The figure now is around 4 billion. 2.5 billion, now we're at 4 billion. And we have not yet examined all the programs because we still have some programs which we have not received. I also think that it is important to ensure that people are having all the chances and the right protection when they work, and we're developing a proposal for protecting rights of persons in platform economies. And these are, because our policy area is under strong subsidiarity, we can also only propose directives and recommendations. We cannot propose regulations, so that whatever is agreed at EU level has to be in a way translated towards national policy action and national legislation to make this reality. Another very important legislation just adopted this year is the Minimum Wage Directive, where we have agreed in a trilogue that member states have to introduce, wherever there are no statutory minimum wages, these procedures for protecting people who are at work of not being working poor. If somebody works full-time, they should be able to survive and sustain their lives. I think that I can speak a lot about the Pillar of Social Rights and what it puts as a frame for the European Social Fund Plus investments, but I want to come back also some of the results from the previous programming period, where in the 2014-2020, the European Social Fund has supported 45.5 million participants. And 5.4 million have been in employment when they left the supported operation. Half of these participants have been women, and that's very important, but also a substantial part have been people with low educational achievements, and that's one of the key investments of DSF, that we have to help people upskill and reskill and also get the right qualifications for the labor market, so that I can quote also another figure of 7.4 million who have gained the qualification as a result of a training supported by DSF. And there is also our impact assessments and evaluations show that the participants under ESF operations have had higher chances of finding employment than non-participants in such investments. Talking about skills, and today I reacted in the just twin transition panel that twin transition cannot happen if we don't have the skilled people. And it means skilled for any stage of the process, even to design what we are going to do, but also on the implementation of what are the main actions that we need to implement in relation to reducing our green impact, our climate impact, and making sure that digitalization works well for everyone. So next year, 2023, is announced as the European Year for Skills, and this means that a lot of efforts or coordination of efforts around Europe will happen to ensure that skills are given the necessary attention, and that skills provided in education or post-education trainings or lifelong learning are adequate to the needs of the labor market. I want to introduce also one thing which I don't believe many of you know. It's that last year, member states and at the Porto Summit, the heads of the governments agreed on 3 high-level targets to be achieved by the European Union by 2030. One of them is the employment levels of everyone in Europe by 2030 should reach 78% of people aged between 20 and 64. And the second is very important target. It's people who are in working age should be able to receive training at least once a year, and this should cover at least 60% of the working age population. And this is a prerequisite, and I think it's a very important action that we need to undertake to ensure that the skills needed for the labor market are there. If we don't focus our efforts and our work towards providing the correct competencies and qualifications, we'll never make the green and digital transition. And another one, the third, in fact, target is to reduce the people at risk of poverty and social exclusion by 15 million from now to 2030, of which at least 5 million children. So these are efforts which the Commission is guiding and discussing with Member States on which are the best efforts to apply for, but the European Social Fund Plus will continue to be the main instrument investing in people for the next programming period, and this is already reflected in the programs that we are currently negotiating, finalizing negotiations. As Nicola de Michelis said this morning, we're really over the top with final programming. I know that our panel was announced about what future work should we need, in what direction our analytical work should go, and I have some questions for you. Maybe you can build upon what you have already done, but it's about what is an identified need for more flexibility or more stability. Shall we go for flexibilizing the implementation, or we continue with some more stable approaches in the implementation of the funds? How shall we focus our spending? Should it be very result-focused and follow the model of the RRF, or we should cater also for the way and means the investments are happening and spending is happening, so we reach a good balance? Can we proceed towards simpler rules, but keeping the responsibility for the sound financial management? And how can we enhance the synergies and complementarities among all the funding instruments? Because we know that, it was mentioned already yesterday, we are overloaded with financial instruments, and we cannot argue against it. It's a fact. But I think that we have already some preliminary assessment of what is the added value of cohesion policy compared to other union instruments and also national instruments, and how can cohesion policy be adapted to address the future territorial, social, economic, climate, demographic challenges? I think demographic challenges will be with us in the next years to come, because we are inevitably, yesterday there was a very clear presentation about demography and numbers of people in Europe changing, so we have to anticipate the impacts of demography changes on our lives, but also on what cohesion policy we have to develop. And I'll stop here. I want to thank everyone for your hard work to do all the research and all the studies that you have conducted so far. I will be looking forward for any further analysis and making sure that we have checked our ideas vis-a-vis your analysis, and we have well evidence-based, but also well-grounded and well-sound decisions about the future of the cohesion policy. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andriana, not only for keeping to time. In fact, you finished 1.5 minutes ahead of your scheduled time, women efficiency, you see. But also thank you for, jokes aside, thank you for providing us. Yes, of course.
She saved the Commission's reputation.
Yes. Well, jokes aside, thank you for giving us a sort of a very comprehensive overview, not only of what the Cohesion Policy and European Social Fund have achieved in the past programming periods, in fact, and in the last period especially, but also on the fact that basically spatial justice cannot go but hand in hand with social justice. So it was really important to remember the ambitious goals, ambitious but achievable goals of the EU pillar of social rights. And for finishing also, thank you for finishing with some trade-offs, providing more sort of points for future reflection. So that was really inspiring. And now, Shime, up to you to take the floor.
Thank you, Laura. Well, good day to everybody once again. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. We have come to the end of the third joint EU Cohesion Policy Conference here in Zagreb. And on the one hand, I must say that I'm a little bit sad and a little bit tired, probably as all of you are, especially after lunch. But on the other hand, I'm very happy and fulfilled because we were finally able to talk in person. We were finally able to socialize, and we were able to, after a while, and we heard that it wasn't a while, to rethink over the future of the cohesion policy here in Zagreb, and getting the insights from the very diverse point of view, from the very diverse experts from all over Europe. Listening to you during the past 2 days, I drew my own conclusions, so I took my notes with me, and I'll try to be brief and say what I have written down. First of all, I must say I'm not a scientist, but rather a practitioner who, by using all of these tools and insights, is trying, together with my colleagues, grasp the best from the cohesion policy for the Croatia as we can. So my thoughts are rather somehow placed from that direction and not the scientific one. What we have concluded so far, in fact, is that, and that's a fact, that the cohesion policy was and still is Europe's main investment tool, and it will be during the 21-27 period. And regarding the future of the policy, when we are talking about, and we were talking a lot of during the last 2 days, beyond the 2027, then I think that we all do agree that it is very hard to say where will the story go. We are all witnessing that we are living in most uncertain times ever. So the black swans are popping up all over the globe, and making the world very unstable and uncertain place to live. And the challenges are more than few. And on that note, it's hard to say anything with 100% certainty. But what we can say right now is that the cohesion policy brings stability and could serve as a safe haven in uncertain time for whole Europe, for all member states, by securing its investment potential of all the member states, and to be the guarantee of a long-term and stable goal. To be very blunt and very concrete, I believe that the greatest challenge for the cohesion policy will be to keep the same significant share within the EU budget, also for the next financial perspective and also beyond. And also, I hope that the main cohesion policy goals will not be questioned and would remain intact. That is particularly important because today everything is questioned. We have heard from many of you that we should return to the roots of the cohesion policy, but with certain adaptation towards flexibilities of cohesion policy and response to crisis. As we said yesterday, we have to readjust the big convergence machine to meet the needs of a new time, the crisis and the uncertainty, and further adaptation of the cohesion policy will be for certain needed. Furthermore, We should protect the cohesion policy from emerging new instruments, instant instruments, I would say, because to implement any kind of an instrument, you need a system. And to develop a solid system, you need time, and you need resources, and you need energy. So we have to defend the system from the fragmentation. And I think we all do agree that the greatest enemy of cohesion today is fragmentation. Besides these rather general thoughts that I have summed up from last 2 days, there are a few very practical main messages that I would like to stress out for today, for the sum up, which will hopefully resonate with you in terms of the future of the cohesion policy. First of all, cohesion policy is not an instant success. Tangible results seeks patience and seeks time. And during the last year, cohesion policy mostly responded to the crisis and was focused on the crisis management more than ever before. Cohesion policy proved to be able to respond to the crisis, but we must be aware that this should not be the rule, as such actions are moving us away from the cohesion goals. Therefore, ensuring the stability of the cohesion policy so it can provide tangible results, not in short, but in medium and long term, that is crucial. Second thing that I wanted to point out is that strengthening of the coordination mechanism is crucial, both in terms of stakeholders involved, as well as growing number of investments instruments. So the transparent sharing, listening, responding to on all levels gives certainty, stability, and confidence among stakeholders. But even the most expert coordination teams are not able to properly and on time and completely communicate increased number of instruments and tools that are growing. And that's a fact, and we have to be all the time aware of it when we are trying to invent a new instrument immediately during the perspective and because of some raising problem or a raising issue. We are failing to bring simple and direct information to our potential final beneficiaries, and this is our major goal. And we should not forget that we are here because of the final beneficiaries and because of the people. So this is why the rules has to be simpler. And to be simple, we cannot invent once in a while a new instruments. Therefore, our aim should not be on development of new instruments, new funds, and new tools, but rather to strive toward their consolidation. Finally, and with this I'll try to go to the conclusions, impacts of the cohesion policy is to the greatest extent possible about human capacities. So in one word, we are good in implementation of cohesion policy to the extent we manage to develop our human capacities. Capacities at all levels, so meaning national level, regional level, and local level, they're all crucial and important to implement efficient cohesion policy. We in Croatia, as the youngest member state, are very proud that during accession period, as well during our first financial perspective, we strengthened our capacities at national as well as regional and local level. And this is also to the great extent thanks to the cohesion policy. And we are grateful for that and thankful, but very much aware that we have to ensure further improvements in this respect and further capacities and building of the capacities in that respect. So this is why this was my last notes from these 2 days. And on this note, I would like to slowly finish my intervention and would like to thank to all of the people who were responsible to the organization. First of all, the team from the Ministry of Regional Development and EU funds. Thank you for that. Together with the European colleagues from the European Commission, together with the colleagues from the Regional Studies Association, for really their dedicated and enthusiastic work in making this event good and very, very well organized for all of you. Once again, I must stress that I'm extremely pleased that this conference brought together such relevant experts, representatives of cohesion policy stakeholders, so the authorities, the representatives of the Commission, representatives of academia. It was really great to have you all here and to be your host. It was also, for my personal opinion, and I believe that I'm saying also on behalf of my colleagues, very good to hear all of these presentations from very different backgrounds and people, and that this was something that was missed before because we haven't managed for a long time to be together. I'm sure that we all agree that our work during the past 2 days shows that we need a conference such as this one, and that in future will be time to do similar conferences such as this one. So without further ado, I want to thank all of you, the organizers and everybody else for the conference, and join the panel discussion for the question if there is any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shime, for bringing to the floor again some very important points, particularly the need to face the greatest challenge of possible budget reductions and protect the allocation to cohesion policy in the next financial perspectives as well. The protection from instant instruments, I loved this expression, but the problem of fragmentation is one that really came up in many of our panels yesterday and today, and it is really a crucial point that actually might detract from the stability of cohesion policy and therefore its ability to deliver. And thank you so much for raising, again, because this is the topic that perhaps came through more constantly throughout all the various sessions, the topic of administrative capacity, institutional capacity of all actors, a concept that is very elusive, you know, when you want to operationalize it, but that has very, very tangible manifestations when it comes to the impact of the policy. So this is certainly something that we need to work more on, and it's certainly a theme that I'm very, very partial towards, because that's what I work on, and so thank you for raising that. Now, before passing the floor to Andres, there is actually a question from the floor, and it says, in light of what we heard, wouldn't it be wise for the Commission to launch a high-level expert group on future cohesion policy? And I think we said yesterday as well and earlier that there will be such a high-level expert group, but I think Mark and Andriana will talk about that in the Q&A session, perhaps more extensively. Andres, I'll pass the floor to you now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. The advantage or disadvantage of having slides is that I said I was going to have no timer, but now I have a timer, I can see the time. It's always great to have a presentation with decision makers. And therefore, I would like to thank the government of the Republic of Croatia. I would like to thank the European Commission, and last but not least, the Regional States Association for having me here. But following Mark, following Andriana, following Shime is a very tough act to follow. Why? Because you want to contrast as a researcher, and many of us here are researchers, how much the work we do actually then goes into policy making and decision making. And from what I heard, it does seem that it is quite a lot. So that, I mean, there are two potential explanations. The first one is that we've been very, very successful at actually convincing decision makers that what we're doing is relevant and can be applied to actual policy making to improve the quality of life and the well-being of citizens wherever they live, in this case, in the European Union. The second explanation is that the policymakers already know what they have to do, and what we do is redundant. I would like to think that it's more or less the former rather than the latter, but nevertheless, otherwise I'll have to close my computer, go home and relax and see how they're doing, and they're doing a very, very good job. But one of the advantages of being an academic and a decision maker is that I can take risks that perhaps are not afforded to those that make the decisions because of the ties that bind them. So I'm going to try to be a bit daring, especially in my conclusions. After all, this is about what is the future of policy, so I try to propose something on the basis of what is happening right now, not just in Europe, but also in many parts of the world. And I'm going to start by highlighting that despite the fact that the World Bank yesterday, Shomik Lal said the European Union has got the biggest convergence machine in the world, despite that Europe has done a very good job, we still have got a very big problem, which is the level of inequality that we have in Europe relative, well, it's lower than any other parts of the world, but nevertheless it's still big and much bigger than what we would like to have, at least for the liking of most of us who live in this continent. And there are two types of inequalities. The first one is interpersonal inequality, which is the one that most economists have been concerned with. And this is the famous Mark talked about before, an elephant in the room. This is the elephant in the graph that you can see there. It comes from Branko Milanovic, it's not my work. On the change in levels of income across the world for people living or having at the different levels of income distribution. And you can see it's like an elephant. Virtually everyone in the developing world, apart from those at the bottom of the pyramid that you can see there in the tail of the elephant, have actually increased their income massively, as have those at the top, the tip of the trunk, which are the richest of the rich, mostly, but not always, living in the most advanced countries in the world. The famous top 2%, Danny Dorling talks about the top 1%. But you can see that there's a valley in the trunk there, in which at levels of 80% of income, there have been people across the world that have had very rough last 2 decades. And who are these people? I'm afraid it's mostly you and me. So it's the middle classes in Europe, the middle classes in most developed countries that have seen, in relative terms, that what has been something that has benefited global integration, globalization, most of the population in the world at large has affected many of us, hopefully not me, but in general we see that negatively. So we do have a problem. And on top of that, we have the problem, which is combined with a big increase in interterritorial inequalities, especially within regions. This convergence machine has been very clear across countries. A lot of Central and Eastern European countries have done very well. But within regions, within countries, it's a far more difficult sort of result. This is something, a map that comes from research that I did with Simona Iammarino, that you know from her excellent presentation on the development trap yesterday, and Michael Storper, in which we have a simple map, 2 colors. Dark green, an overperforming region. Light green, an underperforming region. How do we define an overperforming region? Something as simple that you grow over a quarter of a century, up to 2014, that's when the data stops, and above the average of your country. And now I'm going to take you to look and zoom into France. This is France before the reform of 2016, so they cut the number of regions, perhaps just because they saw the map. But there, out of 22 regions, if you hadn't seen the map, you would imagine, well, there might be concentration, so 5, 6, 10 regions would be growing above the average. No, it's only one. The region of Île-de-France, the region of Paris. 21 other regions grow below the average. Some closer to the average, some like Corsica, very far away from the national average. And when you say, well, the French are different. No, they are the norm. Look at then Portugal, look at Greece, look at Central and Eastern European countries, look at Bulgaria, look at Romania, look at Hungary, look at Slovakia, look at, well, the Baltics are not there. Look at the Netherlands, sorry, not the Netherlands, look at Belgium, look at Ireland, the Nordics, and at the UK before it left the European Union. And you can see that this is a widespread problem. Concentration of growth within countries and others losing out, at least in relative terms, sometimes also in absolute terms. Then look at the case of Italy, And when you have in a country that hasn't grown for the last 3 decades, the places that were already more developed have grown more than the places that were less developed. And the case of Italy is the same for Poland, is the same for France, is the same for the Netherlands, is the same for Spain. So we have a problem, which is then translated into, I'm not going to go too much into that, because it was presented by Simona yesterday, issues like development traps. You saw the map there that comes from the Aid Cohesion report that was in Simona's slide. Then you have the GIF animated. This is really hot off the press. It's a nuts tree. These are the regions in the last 20 years, up to 2020, that have been in a development trap. And when you have the dark red, which is everything around Paris, that means that out of 20 years, according to our definition, you have most of the areas surrounding Paris that have been in a development trap at least 18 out of those 20 years. So virtually all the time, stagnating, not improving in relative terms. And that is translated into something, because when you are seeing that you're not doing well for a year, it's okay, we've been unlucky. If you don't do well for 4 or 5 years, well, we have a depression, but people in Brussels, people in Zagreb, they're making the solutions. When you don't grow for 20 years, when you stagnate for 20 years, when you see employment growth, when you see productivity growth, when you see economic growth, when you see your population decline, you get angry. Because no one is going to solve your problem, and this is coming, and we're seeing everywhere. I think it was Shima who mentioned that we are in the most uncertain times we have experienced, not in our lives, but in my parents' generation. I have to go back to my grandparents to have a situation that was more difficult. And this is because there are many roots for that, but this lack of economic dynamism, this stagnation, is fueling discontent. We can see it in the case of, for example, the US. Donald Trump, who has announced his candidacy yesterday, got 11 million votes more in 2020 than he did in 2016, despite the fact that he lost the election. We were within a whisker, and you can see the increase in vote for Marine Le Pen, or having Marine Le Pen as president of France in the elections earlier this year. And in Hungary, someone who has made an evolution, and I'm sorry to say this in front of Adriana, has won the election against all the opposition, which was close to a Bulgarian communist majority. Yes, I know that. No, that's why I'm sorry. I'm sorry to say it. When Yankov well, they didn't get 99%, but nevertheless, against all opposition, getting the whole country, with the exception of few districts in Pécs, Szeged, and Budapest. So this is a situation that then is transforming into something that affects us all. It's transforming itself into reactions to virtually everything. This is also hot off the press, anti-European, Eurosceptic vote. And you have on the left the strong Eurosceptic vote, on the right there in darker colors, what you have is moderate and strong Eurosceptic votes in every single election between 2018 until national election 2022. The last one is the latest Italian election there. And in dark blue, and we took out the UK because it's outside the European Union, you have, that's more than 40% of votes for parties that are strongly or moderately opposed to European integration: Poland, Hungary, Italy, and France. And you have a lot of other countries, look at Sweden, look at Finland, look at Estonia, look at Slovakia, Austria, where this is growing. The problem is becoming bigger. And as a result, we have serious risks. I'm going to start with the first risk. What are the main risks of having these people in power? Well, the first one is you have climate deniers, you have people that are reluctant, let's say, to admit scientific advice or consider that scientific progress is something good, that people that deny, for example, discrimination against women, etc., or minorities, we have a risk. And you end up with situations like Donald Trump actually recommending, well, if you have COVID, in order to prevent it, we have a problem, you should inject yourself with bleach. And this might sound like a joke, but then you look at the numbers, and that joke actually costs lives, because in 2020, countries that had democracies that had populist governments had 10 points more excess mortality than real democracies, because of the advice of our decision makers, of our politicians, elected politicians in this case. And that creates also not just the direct problems, but also the indirect problems. We've been hearing a lot about transitions. Well, we are one election away from kissing the green transition goodbye and our capacity to deal with climate change, because we cannot afford to re-elect Donald Trump as a global society, because Donald Trump took the biggest emitter with China of carbon emissions, out of the Paris Agreement. If we had elected, as Europeans, or the French had elected, Marine Le Pen, she proposed a moratorium on wind energy and new wind turbines. And the Italians have elected Giorgia Meloni, that came with Fratelli Italia in their program, the idea that let's go nuclear, let's do fracking, let's make sure that we make the most out of the resources, very, very limited natural resources that Italy has to generate energy. Throwing out of the window any sort of green agenda that we might have. So now, in the 2 minutes that I got allocated, what are the policy solutions? We have a serious, serious problem, which is in a way territorial, and how can we try to influence decision makers in order to make sure that we tackle it in the best way possible. The first one is that, well, I'm preaching to the convinced, but this is what I say to when I go to people that couldn't care less about territories. Mark was asking, should we territorialize our policies more? And the first thing I think I would say is we need to preach, we need to recognize, but not preaching doesn't mean let's become part of our religion. Demonstrate that this is in part a territorial problem. It's also a sectoral problem, it's a structural problem, but a territorial problem to a big extent. And unless we recognize that, we will not be able to tackle the problems, that not all spaces are affected in the same way by the processes, by the transitions that we are undertaking. We have to focus as well, as we have seen in this problem of the development trap, on the regions that have fallen through the cracks, that have been either not too poor to attract the attention of the cohesion funds, or not too rich to attract and dynamic to attract the attention of what has been a national policy, mainly, although never stated like this, concentrated on the most dynamic regions in order to make our countries far more dynamic. So we need to bring this idea of development traps, to this idea of stagnation of places that were once the motors of our countries, the motors of Europe, into the whole policy concept. It doesn't necessarily mean more money. It means making an effort, being imaginative, and finding solutions. That means focusing not just on the static, GDP per capita, but also on the dynamic. You can be rich, like in the north of Italy, but not grow for 30 years. And that creates significant economic, social, and political problems. We need to get, and this has been highlighted many times, very serious about the institutional issues, the capacity deal with institutional bottlenecks that actually limit the efficiency of all the efforts that are done, whether it is at the European, at the national, at the regional, and at the local level. And we also need, when we go specifically talking about transitions, to look at the differential impact on territories of the green and digital transitions, because it can derail the whole process. We have a Just Transition Fund, which is fantastic. But Mark said it has been very difficult to negotiate. But the Just Transition Fund fundamentally deals with areas that are depending on brown sources of energy, mainly coal. But the green transition is going to affect virtually a large number of sectors. What about the automobile? Now that has been recognized. But what about transportation and logistics? What about construction? What about, for example, areas like tourism? What about the conflict between, so should we put windmills in places that have been told for many years they should specialize in tourism? What about those conflicts? And how do we deal with them? Because we cannot just keep on generating, piling on discontent after discontent, because as I said before, then we have no green transition we're probably not going to have a digital transition. And then the thing that, this is the most personal and the most political, and this is where I think, I would say, the European Commission and Europe made a big error with the Brexit referendum. It decided not to get political. And that was a big error for Europe, and it has been a massively big error for the United Kingdom. I can tell you, it's very, very cold outside of the European Union, and we are seeing it. I mean, I'm not British, but I love the country. I've been there for 27 years, and we are the laughingstock of Europe right now, and for right reasons. We cannot afford to just stay idle in this situation, and we need to get political. We need to get far more active if we believe that we need to do a green transition, and I think we all, that's something that no one doubts, but we need to have the narrative to say, this has to be done, and this has to be done in a way that maximizes the benefits for all and minimizes those that are, or helps overcome the problems in the short and the medium and in the long term for those that are going to suffer the biggest negative externalities. And the European Commission and the European Union, in this case, not just the European Commission, sorry, the Council, you need to actually lead the way, because you are the most capable and the most able at doing this. And you need to take nation states hand in hand. Because if we don't do it, we are, as I said, one election away of perhaps of not just many of you working for Europe losing your job, but for people like me losing the sort of ideal that we had that has actually led to the biggest, despite all of its faults and need of reform, to the biggest period of prosperity that we have ever experienced in our history in Europe. Although I started saying that we have high inequalities, to the biggest level of equality we have ever experienced in our history. And with the caveats of the Russian invasion, and of course we are in Croatia, so the problems that led to the former Yugoslavia, the biggest period of peace and stability that we have ever experienced in our history. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again. Can I ask the people who control the slides if they could put back the last slide that was shown just for the debate? I think it will be helpful. Thank you, Andres, for really going to the critical point, and it's the point of politics. So you cannot do policy without politics and vice versa. So the two have to be really reconciled. And especially in times of crisis, it's really important that the sort of the responsibility and the responsiveness of the decisions that are taken are there. And so, I mean, I don't want to summarize all the very important points that you raised, except to say that, yes, it is time to get political, and it is no time to sit on the fence. Brexit referendum for me as well. Personally, I'm a Brit as well as an Italian, and I left Britain partly, in large part, actually because of Brexit, and it is having devastating effects for the UK especially, but also for the EU. So this is a mistake, and one has to learn from the mistakes, I think, and it is important really not to repeat this kind of mistake. And the point of the discontent, obviously, you've written a lot. We've read your work on that, and it is really crucial to capitalize on this work with policy solutions that actually can, limit the damage, let's say, and go back into a more sort of sustainable and positive path of development for the whole of Europe. So, yes, I was wondering to start with if there are questions from the floor, and then we'll go back to the point of the high-level group for the future. So I'm sure that there will be plenty of questions, so I don't want to take up any time for questions, even though I have plenty. So I see Vasilis Monasteriotis. So could I ask, Vasilis, I know your name, but for the others, if you could introduce yourself, also tell who you're directing your question or comments to among the speakers, and be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasilis Monasteriotis, LSE. So just a very quick remark that in defense of the European Commission and what they did with the Brexit negotiations, they managed to keep the rest of the 27 in one block, and that was an amazing job. So, but otherwise, I agree with the point that Andres made. So my question is about this, maybe mainly related to Mark Premier, but any of the panelists may want to chip in. about this idea, many speakers repeated today that, you know, the cohesion policy is the investment arm, the main investment arm of the European Union. Actually, I did a course on industrial policy at LSE, and I have different quotes from the Commission website where regional policy is the main tool of the European semester, it's the main investment arm, but then also you have that innovation policy is the main, InvestEU, or what used to be the Juncker plan, is the main investment tool, and so forth. And we had across the conference, you know, so many priorities, you know, for cohesion policy or related interventions. So broadly defined, if you want to deal with emergencies, to deal with innovation, deal with education, deal with skills, you know, territorial cohesion, even socioeconomic cohesion, the less spatial part of it, innovation, the anticipation of future challenges, and so forth. And honestly, I'm very sympathetic to that and understand very well the argument against fragmentation of policy. But aren't we putting too many targets in one policy tool? Aren't we trying to kill, if you want, too many birds? We do have an industrial policy, but actually we do not have an industrial policy because all industrial policy is done through cohesion policy. And so maybe we should actually try to think, okay, we have to protect one part of the cohesion policy, which will be all about redistribution and reallocation in order to reduce disparities. And another part, I would fully agree, a bigger part of that, which is about industrial policy and industrial development. And then we do one of the bullet points that the last slide of Andres' presentation had, which was that you have to support also more advanced places, which have a temporary or less temporary negative shock. But if we just put one policy and try too many targets, and we set out ourselves to get disappointed, to allow people to think that the policy is not delivering, and whatever other criticism one can apply to the policy. Thank you very much.
Is the question for all our speakers or to someone?
Yes, yeah, but I think Mark will be
okay.
the first instance. But yes.
So should we gather a few questions to start with? Is there anyone else who wants to ask or make a comment, in fact? Okay, so I see, well, Thomas Wobben, and then at the back as well, please. Can we take the microphone to the front, please?
Yeah, Thomas Wobben from the Committee of the Regions. Andres, what your last slide is what our mantra is very much, and what Emil Bock also said at the start of the conference. We need cohesion is an overall value of the EU. It is the backbone of the single market. It is the backbone of the whole project. And it's not just a funding tool. It is really an essential element of our democracy to keep us together. For this, we need a political approach. And the political approach needs to be there when the decisions are taken. And you just mentioned, and I just wanted to give a very brief highlight. We have the Green Deal legal package, which was published last year in July. Today, the COREPER agreed on the phasing out of the diesel cars, the private passenger cars. And together with the affected regions, we have included in the legal proposal a reference that the Commission has to come forward in 2 years' time with an assessment whether there is a funding gap for the transition of these regions, these affected regions, in this transition. It's in the legal requirement. And what it says, and when you look at the impact assessment of last year's Green Deal package on the diesel car, there was no reference to territorial effects. And the Commissioner for Industry last week said that the transition of the diesel combustion engine to the batteries will cost 600,000 jobs in this sector. 600,000 jobs in automotive regions. Tomorrow, we're meeting these regions with Commissioner Schmidt, by the way, who is there, in order to do this. And a political commission needs to say, when the legal proposal is coming and there is no territorial impact assessment done, look, if we push this, it has effects on the regions. And we are now trying to reflect on it. And that is the starting point for a strong cohesion policy. If we come back to this where Jacques Delors said, if we open the markets, we need also people, give every region a fair chance to participate. And if we give this transition, we need to be realistic to us what it means for the sectors, for the regions, and what is the gap we do, including, of course, the skills, including the people behind it as well. And I think this political approach is what we need in order to win the debate that cohesion has to stay and has to be part of all EU policies in the future. Thank you.
So there was one further question, and then we stop with you for the moment and let the speakers answer. Thank you. Could you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Aliana Bassi from Coventry University, London. Coventry University, Coventry, not London. Mr. Mark correctly highlights a very crucial word called reform. And reform is something that I guess that we needed after Brexit. Across Europe. European institution is a business. A business has to be reformed because a new economical situation happens, I don't know, chaos happens, pandemic happens, and all these reforms has to be basically adopted. Then Andrea and also other participants also spoke about digitalization, importance of the digitalization. So then we see actually there is a link between the reform and the resource that we have called digitalization, which is these days easy to adopt, take it, private sectors would do it for us. We just need to basically pinpoint in the right direction. I've seen different regions, different cities in Portugal. For instance, Sesimbra in the south of Lisbon. I'm not mentioning actually which party is leading the region, but they don't have the attitudes of bottom-up management, and they're still going with classical linear sort of management. That's why they are very bad in digitalization, and smart city doesn't take any place in that region. Opposite that, we've got Cascais in North Lisbon, which is quite posh area, but they very well understood the impact of digitalization, and they are very close to the citizens, and digitalizations also create this bridge for them, but also they go beyond the connection only with citizens. They bring in something called a cryptocurrency, a token that actually citizens can buy this crypto from the city councils and spend it to pay the tax, to basically pay for the local supermarket and keep the money in the region. So digitalization, it is important, and everybody know that we have to take it, but the institutional characteristic is very important in order to adopt such a reform as a digitalization in a smart city or in different industries. So my question is how basically cohesion policy institution specifically, because they pumping this funding into the regions would basically force, I would say, the regions administration in order to reform in their management and adopt the bottom-up sort of behavior in order to engage more citizens into their management, and we have better collaboration and understanding without being accused to be called the United States of Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll stop here for the moment and we'll go with the questions. So I think I'll ask Mark to start, given that most of the questions were addressed really to start with to you, and then we'll proceed in the same order as the presentations. Please.
Yeah, let's start with the question on whether we have too many goals and we are too dispersed as cohesion policy. Well, the present situation is that cohesion policy does represent 1/3 of the normal EU budget. So it probably also has to answer somehow some basic questions about what it contributes to basic objectives of the Union on top of its core cohesion objectives. We cannot sit simply outside of the policy ambitions that the Union develops. We have a green agenda. We have ambitions. Thomas reminded that we decided on certain concrete consequences of those ambitions, which is, for instance, the end of the combustion engine by 2035. We have digital ambitions. So the future will clearly be largely shaped by those big ambitions, and therefore we should not be blind to them. We should, as cohesion policy, embrace them, but with our cohesion glasses on, seeing how everyone can be on board these ambitions. So I think that it is not abnormal that cohesion policy would have to report on what it contributes to those ambitions. But that should, of course, not blind us to what is our fundamental objective. And here again, what I would argue, also based on, I think, what Andres reminded us of, which is that you have an extremely strong correlation between stagnation or decline of a long-term nature and forces which go against democracy and, of course, then also against European integration as a political project. So there, I think our pitch, which is not one, I must say, generally shared within the Commission even, and also outside, is that when you look at those territorial weaknesses, you can't look at things in a totally compartmentalized and segregated way. I mean, intrinsically, let's take the example, thinking about this automobile transition, of the Batteries Alliance, a typically industrial project, right? Europe was nowhere in batteries and now tries to catch up because it has set itself very ambitious goals, and if we don't think about the whole supply chain of electric cars, basically, our goals will be reached by industrial production outside of Europe. So we are playing catch up. Is this kind of industrial ganging up essential with a top impulse? Absolutely. I am absolutely convinced of that. But then when you look at the territorial challenges that we have identified on the map, how do these two things ultimately fit together? Will the territories that today struggle be saved by the Batteries Alliance? No, they will not be saved by the Batteries Alliance. So we need an approach which is a comprehensive one. And this is what I think cohesion policy uniquely can offer. There is no other thing in the toolbox which can offer that, and which can combine all the different elements, and of course also taking, where it is relevant for the territories concerned, taking some heed from those EU-wide collective big ambitions and their declination also in terms of industrial policy. I mentioned the Batteries Alliance. We can talk of space. We can talk of many such initiatives at European level, which can or cannot be relevant for individual territories. On the combustion engine, Adriana will want to say something on that as well. I think this is indeed a prime example of the sometimes lack of territorial sensitivity which exists. everywhere. Everywhere. We are the exception for now. We are not the rule in terms of how policymakers think. And yes, I agree with you. If you put forward a proposal, and now it has been decided by the EU's co-legislators, which implies that you will, within 13 years, fundamentally change the business model, the industrial production lines of a sector which represents, if I remember well, overall something like 10% of jobs in the EU, if you take everything. And you don't, at that point, also ask yourself, where on the map is it going to make a change? You are missing one point of sensitivity, which is the one of territorial cohesion. And as you know, we are preachers, yes, of territorial impact assessments. And this, I think, is one very good example where a territorial impact assessment should follow, catch up with what is by now the very clearly decided timeline for a very, very fundamental transition. And finally, on the question of well, administrative practices, right, and cultures, and bottom-up approaches, which are, again, pretty rare, I think, in administrative cultures across Europe. I do believe that we can do more to promote that, but it's very difficult to change administrative cultures. I think I did emphasize the point, giving the example of the Just Transition Fund, that we should think of generalizing that much more and being more demanding on participatory approaches, on local participation, which will come, I think, partially naturally if indeed we have a more clearly targeted territorial focus in cohesion policy interventions. But this again also means that we need to be comprehensive and we need to think about, as Andres put it there, institutional issues and how we can influence them.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time because I've been told that we really need to be prompt and finish at 3:45. So I will ask the other speakers to be on the time. So Andriana first, and then Andres, and then we'll go to Shime. And yes, please.
I just wanted to come back to Thomas's concern. We are aware of the impact of this decision on combustion engines, but I want to tell you that the Battery Alliance started already last year, and the objective is in the next 5 years to have 800,000 people trained for the batteries. So you're talking about 600,000 which are at risk of losing their job, but at the same time we will be requalifying or qualifying 800,000 people for the batteries chain in general. And the question is not that regions who are now producing the old-fashioned, so to say, cars, I don't say Audi is old-fashioned, very nice, but that it's up to them to take it up. And because the Battery Alliance is a private-public partnership, it works with universities, with secondary education schools, it works with the same approach, same curricula all over Europe, wherever countries have decided to join this alliance, that they will be the ones leading on this. It's really not a question of putting somebody aside because he's producing something old. I know Audi is also producing electric cars, and many of the brands in Europe are producing already electric cars. So the question comes how they can do this conversion. Will they have the materials? Will they have everything in the supply chain and the skilled people to do this? So your meeting tomorrow is very timely. I believe my commissioner will make the point about the Battery Alliance as well. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Andres. This is my last speech. I just want to thank everyone, all the technicians who are very, very good, and even here and in the workshops. And also, again, really appreciating a lot the chance to have some exchange in these 2 days. Thanks a lot to our hosts from all these people who are here on the screen, and especially the Croatian colleagues. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll be brief because I think that Mark has covered most of the questions in the way I wanted to cover them. Just a brief comment on the whole issue of the sectoral impacts. The green and the digital transition are going to have a massive impact and lead to a massive transformation, which is absolutely necessary for our economies, but it's going to affect virtually every single sector and therefore every single space. So whatever we do, there's going to have to be, some are going to be benefits, some are going to lose out, and they are not evenly distributed. And it's not just a question of industrial policy. The indirect effects go further because you're saying, well, 600,000 jobs that might be lost, you're training 100,000 jobs, but a lot of people are using diesel cars. We have the example of what happened before with the diesel tax in France and the Gilets jaunes, that people that just 15 years ago were told by the French government and the British government, buy a diesel car because it is the future. And now we know they can kill us, so we need to get rid of them. But they were the future. And in the meantime, they have seen their bus services, their train services decline, their school buses disappear, that they have to go further away to buy their tools for trade, to take their children to school, that they depend on the only mode of transportation, which was the one recommended. And now they're telling, you are first polluting, so you are responsible for the crisis. And on top of that, you're going to have to pay for something that is perceived that is the people in Paris that have world-class public transport and where the biggest metro system, the biggest construction system in the whole of Europe, possibly in the world, is now being built. You're pushing us to that. So we are going to bring the country to a standstill. And what I think the important thing here, I think Mark has said it, we need what I think is missing big time, or we have partial impact assessments. When we did the single market, we had impact assessments inside out. Now we're doing something similar, and we're missing that sort of impact assessment. In our case, a territorial impact assessment that was called by Mark. If we do that, we're going to have a much fairer transition, and we're going to reach the goals and the missions that we want to achieve as Europe in a way that is going to maximize the benefits for everyone while minimizing the risks and making sure that those that are suffering the negative impacts have got alternatives in the short, medium, and long term.
Thank you. So I'll pass the floor now to Shime, and I'll ask him to also try and ask a question that we received online, which is about how can we change the business as usual sort of mentality and feeling that prevails in the implementation of cohesion policy in the member states. I think this would be like a question for a conference, but if you can spend a couple of words, given your experience, as a member state person who implements cohesion policy.
Well, it's a very broad question. I try to understand it. I must say that I don't understand the word like a fixture of what he says, yes?
Or she, wouldn't know.
Yes, he or she. Yes, but I think that it refers on how can we redesign and rechange the cohesion policies not to be such a traditional, stable and boring. So I think that was the essence of the question. So how to change the business as usual? I think there is no an easy answer to that. I think that they all take a part of it, even the Commission and the member states in it. So the Commission provides the framework, and I think that it cannot do a lot more from it. And on the member states, it is the responsibility to do the super cool investment policy for their country. So I think the responsibility lies more or less on, in terms of the question, on the member states trying to sell the policy and investing priorities, everything they put inside of their cohesion policy for their state, inside of it. So yeah, that's it.
You wanted to say a couple of things also in response to the first question, if I'm
No, it's
not
okay.
wrong?
I think
You're
Mark
done.
and my colleagues are
Okay.
already done, so.
Thank you very much. So we are basically finishing off because we have 2 minutes left. So I know that there are other questions from the floor, but I'm afraid that we don't have time to take them. But discussions will continue. I would like to conclude with a few points for furthering this work. First of all, I want to thank all the speakers for their very thought-provoking ideas and for their sort of strong commitment to cohesion policy. This is something that we all have in common, and it was really good to be here and to have this sense of community, I think. More generally, I think that this session really, and also the preceding ones today and yesterday, have been really, really useful to set kind of the baselines for an evidence-based reflection on what I think should be, or what we think should be the future priorities of cohesion policy, how it should be reformed in terms of the priorities that it should favor and pursue, which is what in the lexicon of public policy analysis for the political scientists in the room is, the agenda-setting stage of the policy-making cycle. But of course, once you set an agenda, there are other stages in the policy cycle that you have to go through as well. So there's policy formulation, and then you have to implement the policy, and then you have to learn from implementation through evaluation. So I think a key question now is, where do we go from here? This has been really useful, but what do we do next? I think, of course, a lot of more work needs to be done, not only to refine the kind of priorities we've been talking about, long-term, short-term, how to deal with crises insofar as they are tied to cohesion policy goals, and more generally, how not to pursue fragmentation, but deal with a lot of different needs. So there's these points that we need really to clarify, but I think we also need to work in at least another 5 directions. And I think, first of all, we need to identify the right policy tools to achieve the ambitions that we talked about during this conference. And we're needed also to reflect how to improve the existing policy tools, the tools that have been deployed so far. And I think there's a lot of work already underway in this respect, which needs to be, of course, continued in the future. Second, I think we need to continue reflecting on how to best support implementation, and especially, and this has been coming through and through again and again throughout the conference, how to support in the best and the most effective way the creation of institutional and administrative capacities, what we mean by them, for which actors we need to build capacities, and how can we do so in a way that is tailored to the specific needs of different actors, but also different territories and regions in Europe. I think a third direction of work that we need to undertake collectively is to identify how to engage citizens more. And I think Yoshime also mentioned this earlier. We need to implement new ways to not only have citizens participate in the decision-making, but also in the implementation of the policy, so that citizens, civil society become real active actors in the process of change that cohesion policy aims to ignite, because policies are about change, and cohesion policy, first and foremost, is about a positive change, for example, towards green, digital, but also social justice as well. And then fourth, certainly we have to work, and it is related to the citizens' engagement issue, we have to communicate more the results of the policy, because people do not know what the EU does and what it has achieved. They don't see it until they lose it, like in the Brexit case. But also what cohesion policy has achieved historically is still massive, and it is not really perceived by the population. So it's something really to think carefully about. And I think Andres' presentation was really crucial in making us understand the consequences of not doing that, political consequences. And I think the last point I wanted to raise is the fact that we really need to make sure that we don't talk about cohesion policy as something that is, a world in itself. Cohesion policy interacts with a lot of other policies, European policies and domestic policies in the member states. It interacts, of course, crucially with the Next Generation EU, the RRF, and with the national resilience and reform plans that are implemented in the member states, and that include those reforms that cohesion policy in the past was pushing for, like public administration reforms. So we really need to work to make cohesion policy synergistic with other policies. And this is, I think, a challenge that has to be tackled at all levels to break down silo mentalities, even within the Commission, in my view, but you might have some comments on that. So this is just to say that there's so much more work to be done for scholars, for policymakers, and to start with, I think we can continue this work collectively in Ljubljana at the annual 2023 conference in June next year, in just a few months. But meanwhile, please join me in thanking all of our speakers, all our amazing hosts, and all the organizers, the Commission, of course, the Regional Studies Association, and of course the hosts here in Croatia. And well, thank you all for participating so actively, and please join me in a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.